if you would like to sit close to me so that we can take some questions, because I think that you mentioned and you touched upon so many interesting points that we could really open the Pandora's box for the people present here in the room. So we have Tim Sturgeon first to pose a question.
I really enjoyed your remarks. I think in this context here, I'm not a statistician, but I'm a user. But I sometimes try to assist the statistical agencies to update their classifications and deal with knotty problems. So what I see is more and more knotty problems coming down the pike for statisticians to deal with. If it's globalization, the fragmentation of production across the world, that pushes statisticians to look outside of their national boundaries, to compliance with environmental standards, you know, and on and on. And so the problem, I think, is folks being pushed outside of those controllable environments where you can really, you know, tightly control and be sure of your statistics. So I think that drives a lot of the discussion about using novel forms of data, et cetera. So on the other hand, I see in our country, in the U.S., I mean, the equivalent of the Joint Research Center is the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, that provides these nonpartisan assessments of very, very knotty problems. And not only are they knotty and difficult, but they're hugely, highly charged politically, and the timeline to turn around the objective, quote-unquote, analysis is extremely short. So in that context, I mean, I'm shocked by the CBO's, the maintenance of their reputation for objectivity under that extreme pressure. So it's not that, it's impossible, given what they're dealing with, that it's because they have a rigorous process, but they're still considered nonpartisan. So the question is really, you know, to you really is, what is there besides the methodology being very, very tight that can give the kind of power to statistical agencies and other analysis in these types of situations where you don't have, where it's not possible to do that?
Thanks, Tim. Please. It should be working.
I wish I knew, and it is, you know, a bit surprising and impressive that this U.S. Economic Office has managed to sustain its reputation, but it's always in danger, and maybe this is the administration that will kill it. So, and what do you do with a thing like that? But I think, you know, not really knowing, but my impression is that they are quite conscientious and somehow have at the same time, there has to be a lot of...
Can you stay closer to the microphone? No, it's fine. Just if you can hold it a little bit closer. Yeah, thank you.
Is this on now?
No? Please, just... Otherwise, we try with this one. Yeah, this one, please.
I would suppose at the same time that there's some... I mean, they depend on political allies. And so you don't... They aren't, you know, free of politics, and yet maybe you can have support for an expert and, you know, as much as possible nonpartisan approach. But what's nonpartisan? There's no easy answer, and we'll see whether the Congressional Budget Office survives. By the way, I'm also, I mean, you know this, but I'm a historian who's been very interested in statistics, and I actually notice, you know, here, you know, many of us came here perhaps and thought that we were the non-statistician, you know, that if actually, I think it's, I don't know whether the professional statisticians would exactly agree with this, but I think it's extremely commendable that there's no kind of, that this is a very open forum, that you could have. There's plenty of things that statisticians can discuss among themselves, but they have questions that they would like to have different perspectives, and they have invited people like us. I'm quite honored to have been asked to participate in this, and I also think it's, I mean, I don't know about me in particular, but the openness of the group to different kinds of people is very encouraging to me.
I think that that's an open scenario where you might see also statisticians being engaged somehow, you know, to have, as you quoted Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he was also saying, of course, that there is a question of a conscience before science. Now, it depends how you want to define the conscience, and, you know, it is a product of an ecosystem and culture, etc. But maybe there is also an open floor for a specific commitment and taking a leading role into that. I don't know if this is, you know, something that could be the case now of America, maybe, the United States or someone else, but still it's out there. Anyone else, please? We still have 2-3 minutes before we pass the floor to Aminda for the continuation. Please don't be shy. You had your coffee break. You should have adrenaline somehow. Someone that would like to ask a question. Otherwise, I will.
You could.
I would have a question for you, Professor, if you don't mind. If
Please.
No one is taking the risk, I'm taking mine. I was following a little bit the trajectory of your lecture, and the connection between the political dimension. You know, Aristotle was. I mean, it's the zone political. So is the political animal. Statistics comes from the word, of course, as you mentioned, state. So nowadays, this pursuit of objectivity, of neutrality, is it clear out there that is still connected to a set of values and political leadership? Because at the end, if we consider politics as an allocation of priorities and resources in order to pursue what the people, the society is asking the rulers of their society, is it still clear there that anything that would come out, data, analysis, and then, you know, the formation of knowledge, is still connected to a set of values coming out of each society, or this has been a little bit lost? Would like to have, you know, like some reflection on your side. How do you see that, at least in your concrete experience?
I'd say, do you mean that that the knowledge should be associated with our values, or
I don't know
or
if
the political
should.
values?
I don't know if should.
Well,
but
yeah,
there are
well,
people advocating for the fact that it's inherently connected to that.
Well, I mean, I guess it's not surprising that people would struggle also over statistics when interests are at stake, as they are, and it actually takes strong institutions, which, you know, whatever the Congressional Budget Office perhaps has been such a thing, and statistical offices. It's not as if state statistical offices have not had their measures changed sometimes for political reasons, and yet many have sustained you know, a good deal of independence, and that's to their credit, and that actually is something which is probably advanced by you know, maintaining as rigorous as possible and nonpartisan as possible and important and you know, meaningful as possible measures. But it also actually depends on the ability of statistical offices and statisticians to perform, you know, their role effectively. Also depends on, as the first poll suggested, an ability to tell narratives, to make things meaningful. We hope that you know, Rousseau already had this in mind, and we've seen many statisticians have defended their craft as providing information that the public needs in order to assess its leaders, and these are all, and or to you know, to try to evaluate the effects of systems on the poor as well as the powerful, and these are things which are important too, and which can't be reduced to simple mechanical production, though you want the best numbers you can get.
Thank you very much. So with this, I would like to thank again Professor Ted Porter for an incredibly interesting contribution for us. Again, a big round of applause for him. And I pass now the floor. Thank you, Professor. I pass now the floor to my colleague Aminda, that's going to take you through the next panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we're missing a couple of people. I know that one of our panelists is in the building, and I'm not quite sure where the other one has disappeared to. All right, well, we can start as we are, in fact, I think that might be Xaquín. Is that you? No. Okay. Right, well, when they come, they can come up onto the stage. If someone wants to go and have a look in the speakers room and see if we can find them there, that would be quite useful. Thank you. Okay, so thank you to Ted Porter for that incredibly interesting keynote speech. And we're now going to the final panel of our day. I'm sure you're probably quite glad this is the final panel because it's been quite intense. But this is one that's really sort of all aimed at certainly the statistics community, because we're going to be talking about communicating statistics in the digital era. And given that everybody here has a connection to official statistics, either past, present, or as a producer, or as a user, and as a journalist, I think I count myself in that. I think it's fair to say we have a vested interest in this topic. And now I'm going to stop and let the other two missing chairs, thank you. It's okay. You weren't expecting us to start on time, you see. We got you on the hop. Thank you. Okay, so communicating statistics in the digital era. As we just heard from Ted Porter, the practical work of statistics is not simple. It's prone to outside influence, for example, from politicians, and not just on fiddling the figures, but perhaps not even publishing the figures. We'll hear perhaps about that during the course of our discussions. And then, of course, many people don't really understand statistics, as we heard this morning. Or even worse still, in this post-truth age, they don't care what the numbers say anyway. But perhaps in this new environment, there could be new opportunities for official statistics, and they could confirm their role as a trusted party providing objective figures. So our panelists are going to be discussing this, and I'm now going to introduce you. On the far end, we have Natalia Hernández Rojo, who presents the fact-checking segment of the weekly current affairs TV program El Objetivo, which is broadcast on the Spanish TV channel La Sexta. It first aired in June 2013, so a good 3 years before the Oxford English Dictionary chose post-truth as its word of the year in 2016. And if you think fact-checking is difficult, try making it appealing on television too. That's even harder. I'm not going in the order of everybody sitting next to me because my cards are in a different order and I'll get myself mixed up and I don't want to do that. So I'm now going to introduce Roger Pielke, who is the Director of Sports Governance Center at the University of Colorado in the USA. His research concentrates on science, innovation, and politics. And his work has been recognized with various accolades, including the Public Service Award from the Geological Society of America. He's also author, co-author, or co-editor of 7 books and many publications, including one that caught my eye, entitled The Truthiness About Hurricane Catastrophe Models. Next to me here, we have Jim Ridgway, Emeritus Professor at Durham University in the north of England, where I grew up in that area, but not that that makes much difference, but if we're talking about narratives, that's a story for you. He's an applied psychologist with a particular interest in conveying complex information in ways that make it comprehensible to people with little background in statistics, something that I think is a very interesting thing for us to discuss today. He directs the SMART Center for publications including curriculum materials and interactive data visualizations. And his team collaborated on with the House of Commons Library in the UK to develop what was called the Constituency Explorer. This was an interactive data visualization that presented a huge amount of information at constituency level, which means MP level, ahead of the 2015 general election in 2015 in the UK. And in fact, I seem to remember I played with that at the time. We're also joined by Aurel Schubert, who is the Director General for Statistics at the European Central Bank. He's also chairman of the Statistics Committee of the European System of Central Banks, and he serves on several Austrian and European statistical bodies. He's written many publications in the field of monetary and banking policy and history, and he's also published on central bank statistics. He participated in the Power from Statistics Roundtable on this subject that we're discussing this afternoon in Frankfurt. And last but not least, we have Xaquín González Veira, which he shortens to GV at the end. He's an award-winning visual journalist from the region of Galicia in northwestern Spain. He's recently led the visuals team at the Guardian newspaper in the UK, combining graphics, interactive, multimedia and photo editors all working together. And he's also worked at National Geographic, the New York Times and El Mundo. He designs codes, writes interactive data and produces visual journalistic stories. I was particularly struck by two of his projects: The Guardian's interactive infographics for the Rio Olympics, particularly how Usain Bolt made history with his third 100 meters gold medal victory, which was great. It was really good fun to play with. And the rather different infographic-driven story on the subject of how to fix a toilet, which he did in collaboration with Google News Lab. It reveals more than you would expect it to. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to all our panelists. So we're going to start with our first topic, which looks at alternatives to official statistics, or alternative statistics. Nowadays, thanks to the democratization of technology, it's all become cheaper. We all have smartphones now, and of course access to information. Citizens and policymakers can find statistics and evidence everywhere and in many different places. But some of it is not necessarily accurate, as we all know. But it's sometimes hard to tell just by looking at it, particularly if it's beautifully packaged. So this topic is going to look around, is it possible to spot alternative statistics? What's the appropriate approach to take when such figures are promoted? And how can official statistics motivate its continued existence? How can it carry on in this world where it has so much competition? And to give us an introduction to this topic, I'd like to call on Natalia Hernández Rojo, the fact-checking presenter from El Objetivo.
I want to ask you some question. Do you know if Spain is the fastest growing country in the European Union, or spend China €0 on pensions? Anyone know it? Well, I don't know, but I can tell you that all these arguments are false, and sadly they have been used for years by a Spanish politician, one time and another time. As you know, political representatives use argument in interviews, press conference, radio, on television, and now also for social networks, and sometimes these do not always fix with the reality provided by the data. But how do we know when we are being lied to? When they are not saying the truth? This is the real question, and it's what fact-checking do. So how can we fight with that, just with good information and good data? So in El Objetivo, we always work with official data. We think it's the best way to say if the politician is saying the truth or not, because, for example, in Eurostat, you have the information of all the countries, so you can compare between different countries. now we are talking to the post-truth moment, so we need to be more accurate than ever, and you can help us, the people who do the statistics, to the journalists. I think you can help us to be more easy, more accessible, and more comprehensive, not just in the interpretation of the statistics, even to find information, because I think there are a lot of information that the journalists don't know it. So I'm very interested in official data. I have the responsibility as a journalist to provide to the audience the best sources and the most clear and transparency sources. Is the official data for me? I don't say that the unofficial data is not a good point to have ideas, for example, for an issue about you are investigated. But at the end of the day, for the fact checker, official statistics is our source. I'm not going to stop using that, I have to say. And I think perhaps Eurostat and other statistics office can improve the data exposure, sell more the product, be more democratic, as you say, because sometimes people don't know that this information are there, and it's complicated for us to be quickly and to fight with the true stories of the politician, and I think this is very important for us.
Okay, I know we were talking about, I'm sure everybody in the room is very happy that you want to continue using official statistics, but can you just give us an example of, perhaps a very short example of how you said you can use them as an alternative statistics as a way of getting ideas. How would that work, for example?
Yeah, for example, in Spain, and I think in other countries too, we have figure called pardon. The pardon. They used by the government in some cases to avoid the prison for some people. In Spain, they are not being used properly sometimes, we can say it. So we don't have a database about the pardon. But the information is 6 and is in the bulletin official in Spain, but they are not together, or it's not all the information together. So there are a foundation in Spain called CBO, I don't know if you know, but it's so transparent, and they have very clear information that put all the data together and do like a timeline of the pardon around a lot of years. So if I want to know if a politician is saying the truth or not, reference to a pardon, should I say no or yes just because this statistics? I think not just with that statistic. It's so completely, the methodology is so clear, but I think I have to go to the official data and I have to check again. So this is where it's
or you can use the alternative statistic and say, hello, I've got this. If you've got the data, can you tell me what your data is, what the real data is? So a way of pushing the politicians or the government.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
Okay.
We also do that.
Mm. I don't know if anybody else from our panel wants to jump in.
I think kind of connecting with what she was saying right now about the CBO, for instance, they're very clear about their methodology. I think it's not an easy way to spot alternative statistics, although the adjective easy is a little relative. For me, it would be easy if I suspect, if there's no methodology, if they're not transparent in what they're, in their methods, in how they got to that point, then I'm going to suspect they have an agenda. Also, journalists are not used to look at who commissioned the surveys. So, and this is like with the incrementation of think tanks, especially in the U.S. or I think in Europe, they're getting also very common. they do have an agenda. Think tanks do have an agenda, and it's sort of easy to spot. Governments also have an agenda, but they're kept in check in a pretty systematic and good way. We're still a sort of democratic society in most countries in Europe. Sorry, but I think it's if we ask ourselves when we're communicating that as journalists, I'm always talking about journalists. If we ask ourselves, what did they want to get to with this report, with this information? Who paid for this, and what is their methodology? Like we need to be skeptics when we get those statistics, and then it'll become easier to spot those alternative statistics. But as she was saying, I would stick to official statistics. In most countries in Europe, the statistical offices are very happy when you ask them to get you microdata or to give you more than what they did in the executive summary. They're a little weary of how you would manipulate them, but if you establish a connection with them, if you treat them as sources, they'll be better for democracy.
Jim, I know you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think we underestimate the problem. I think we've actually got an existentialist crisis about the status of knowledge. It's not simply fake knowledge versus real knowledge, it's what counts. One side you have this notion of, I would like to say, evidence-informed policy, because I think evidence-based policy is folly. On the other hand, you have the only thing that's important is political reality. So there's actually the whole existence of outfits like Eurostat, the whole scientific enterprise is actually under threat. So it's not simply can we tell the good stuff from the bad stuff. There's a rhetorical battle to be fought. So that's the first point I want to make. Then a couple of kind of points of information. In the UK, Full Fact, which is the fact-checking organisation, have got money from Google and from the UK government to actually attempt some AI approaches for fact-checking, which I think is an interesting sort of development. I think people like Eurostat should think very carefully about how to index their data in such a way that it is very easy to get answers to certain kinds of questions. You might start off at a question of fact and so on, and sort of nested, but actually thinking about how, as I say, how can we index things so that they're easy to find. Okay.
Thank you. Aurel, and then Roger.
Just a few words now, maybe a good news about the use of official statistics. So tomorrow in a week there will be the press conference of the President of the European Central Bank after the next monetary policy decision on the 26th of October. And I can promise you, whenever he announces the decision, he will not say something having looked yesterday at the tweets of last week and counter-checking this information with the latest Google Trends data. We decided sentiment in Europe is improving and we're going to raise interest rates. So that's not going to be. So he will be referring a lot to all kinds of official statistics. So we are not yet in the world to use alternative facts, at least not there where our reputation and decisions are based on. So I think you can check it then as a fact checker, Natalia, then next week. So I think. And just a few words, if I'm allowed, just to, first of all, everything I say is my own and not the official position of the European system of central banks. But it's important to understand that we as central banks, we are both, you can say, Janus face. So we are both producers of statistics, but also power users of statistics. And I will, I guess, jump around in the different functions today. And it is, you called it evidence not based, but evidence inspired. So all policies of the ECB, and you can check these, are evidence inspired. So either monetary policy financial stability, or now since 2014 also banking supervision. They are all evidence-based because you have to make decisions on the basis of what is happening, and for that you use official data, official statistics. And you, as the first president of the European Monetary Institute, which before the European Central Bank, said nothing is more important for monetary policy than good statistics. Now, in the meantime, you can extend it to the other functions also. But he didn't say only that, but he said that first of all to analyze, to make the decisions, but then also to follow up on what happened after our decisions. And then he said, but also in order to explain why we have decided, what we have decided, and that the people understand us. And if they don't understand us, they don't trust us. So you have the whole chain, why this is important. And that I think is absolutely, absolutely crucial. And there it comes in that whatever you use has to be good. So we can talk later about maybe internal use of other data, but where your reputation is online, you better use something that is reliable.
Roger?
Yeah. First, thanks for having me. It's great to be here, and I should say, coming from Colorado, good morning to everyone. The title of this conference is Power from Statistics, and I want to emphasize it's just as important to focus on statistics from power. And I want to just make tell a brief story that illustrates that the notion of post-truth isn't really about true versus false. It's about situations where true versus false is not even a coherent question. So let me just give you a very short story. In 2012, Superstorm Sandy was in the Atlantic Ocean heading up the East Coast. It would eventually take a left turn and run into New York City, as many of you know. But while this was happening, there was a big debate going on over whether Superstorm Sandy, and we call it Superstorm Sandy, was in fact a hurricane or not. The reason this debate was important was because $20 billion of insurance payouts depended on that definition. And I'll simplify quite a bit, but hurricane insurance in the US in many regions is tied to official government statistics. So you go to the agency, the National Hurricane Center, and if they say it's a hurricane, then it's a hurricane. In this case, I won't bore you with the details, but it was a post-tropical cyclone, not a hurricane, and its wind speed was in the 60 miles an hour range, not 74, which is needed to be a hurricane. So during this time, you had state elected officials, insurance commissioners, calling the National Hurricane Center, begging them to classify it as a hurricane so their citizens wouldn't have to pay out and the insurance companies would have to pay out. At the same time, the insurance companies were lobbying the Hurricane Center not to call it. So how was this resolved? This was resolved when the governor of New Jersey issued an executive order that said, Superstorm Sandy is a hurricane, by law. 6 months later, the National Hurricane Center came out with its assessment, and it wasn't a hurricane. So if you ask the question, what's the official record on the statistics of Superstorm Sandy? Was it a hurricane or not? Well, you tell me what answer you want, and I can give you that answer. The answer that led to $20 billion going from insurance companies to coastal residents was the one that had policy impact. But in that situation, the statistics took on a very different, now this isn't, we don't see this in all cases of statistics, but in this case, it's a special case where it was post-truth. The facts on the ground no longer had meaning as we would expect them to in a lot of these other cases.
Thank you, Roger. And in fact, that example is going to lead me nicely onto our first question of this panel, which is slightly different to the angle that we've been discussing up until you raised that. And the question, the voting is now open, and the question is, how should official statistics engage with alternative facts? Should they provide constructive criticism, publicly point out bad practices, by some other approach, or not at all? And we're going to leave the voting open for a little bit. Have we got any questions from Twitter coming in so far? No? Okay. I'm going to leave the polling open. Does anyone from the audience have anything that they would like to mention or add or ask from what we've already heard? There's a lady there. Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you.
Marlene Smith from Eurostat, advisor. I have a question with respect to the person, let's say the citizens, how they interpret data. And I would like to speak directly to the people who are facing this with journalism. And it is sometimes difficult to convince people with facts. I think you know best, because a journal also speaks to emotions of people. And the difficulty is you might have as many data as you want. Sometimes the person says then back, yes, but this is not what I experienced. This is not what I think is the situation. And I would like to know whether you have special mechanisms to put that question of the person into perspective and say, yes, you in your situation might not see this, but in another situation it is different. I think this is the challenge in using figures in the media, and the media are so important because a lot of people make their judgments on things that happen through the media.
I think that's for you guys down at that end. Perhaps also me, though I can see you're also.
Yeah, I think this is very important and is so complicated because if sometimes when the citizen has something in the head, it's so complicated even if the information that you are showing is true and he is not or she is not right. But it's true that sometimes you have to say, okay, maybe this percent of people represent the people who are suffering poverty and they can pay, I don't know, the bills. But it's true that inside this percentage maybe is someone who is not affected. But what can we do? Say, okay, but the statistic is what it is. So we know that we have different, I don't know, kind of mistakes. I don't know if say it that way. So it's important to say before that, okay, maybe it's not all the people who are affected by this, and you have to know that. Maybe it's before say the data, say these questions.
There's two ways I can answer this. I'm going to leave one of the ways for later when we talk about visualization and interactives. The other way is a phrase that a colleague of mine at The Guardian, Helena Bengtsson, I see that I know there's people from Sweden here. She's a very well-known Swedish data journalist, and she led the data team at The Guardian. And it's that the best data story doesn't have a single number on it. And it's because you've used your data and you've done your data reporting so well that you've found the human stories that convey those trends in the best way. I think for our readers, framing our stories in human terms are our best tools to get to them. And we're not trying to convince them. As a journalist, I would never try to convince my audience. I want to give them a sense of what's going on in the world so they can make an informed decision when it comes to whatever the story is about. But I think it's very, very important to just not spit out. It is something that as journalists we do sometimes with data, is that we just spit out the statistical measures of whatever they've given us. And the true power of what we can do is put it frame it in a way that the person can connect with it. But I don't have many specific mechanisms or strategies that I use. It depends on each case, but I think it's more of an attitude or a conscious decision. I am going to try to frame this in a way that either I explain the trends very well or I just use human stories to communicate those trends. And I think that keeping that in mind constantly is the key.
Okay, I can't get to your question now, but I won't forget about you, okay? I promise. Now, I'm going to close the voting, so the voting is now closed. Jim, did you want to say something about that question?
Yeah, I think some of it is the way data is presented, that it's quite hard sometimes to get at disaggregated data. So you have a headline figure, and you actually want to say, well, is that true north and south? Is that true for men and women? Is it true for old people and young people? Is it true for people from different ethnic groups? So you say, okay, 250,000 migrants, population 70 million, so hey, barely detectable. Well, maybe it's barely detectable where I live, but it might not be barely detectable where you live. So disaggregation is a big part of the piece, I think, and some of the data viz helps us get at that.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to, can we reveal the poll results, please? So, it's the winning column is publicly pointing out bad practices. So not actually just constructive criticism. We don't really like that. You actually, I wonder what the by some other approach is. It's a bit vague, but interesting that obviously people think that there are other approaches. Any reactions from our panels on if it's a good idea to be publicly pointing out bad practices? Yeah?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and we think that people who know better should correct those who don't. But in the United States, we've seen a practice of fact checkers getting fact checked in the sense that people are now counting how many Republicans do they correct versus how many Democrats do they correct. And the trust and legitimacy in fact checkers then becomes an issue if they're perceived to be unbalanced or biased one way or another. And we like to think of knowledge as a hierarchy. We saw the pyramid there that, ultimately it's somewhere up at the top, somebody's got the ultimate truth. But I think a better model is it's like a big circle, like a dog chasing its tail. We all keep each other accountable. And so if government agencies in particular, like the UK recently corrected Boris Johnson, the statistical agency, are going to be in the business of correcting politicians or others, then they have to realize that that's a very political act, and they too then will be subject to the same critique that they're applying to others. It's something to be aware of because you can lose legitimacy really fast.
Oh, we've got two more, and then Aurel, first you.
I just would do it the other way around, is basically to differentiate yourself from the alternative facts, to insist and live up to the transparency of your methodologies, your sources, how you compute, and also all the way to quality assessments, quality reports, where you show what you are doing and you differentiate yourself and leave it then to the users to see that what he or she uses doesn't live up to these quality standards. So I think that's more, and I'm fully with you. The more attention you give to these things, the more you might, since the people don't differentiate so much, the more they might believe it, because the more they hear it.
It's a shame we can't redo the poll, actually, and see if you've changed your mind after listening to these things. Comments? Anyway, Jim.
So back to Boris Johnson. He has the phrase, he has advice. Over a dinner conversation, you're losing the argument. What should you do? You put a dead cat on the table, and suddenly everybody wants to talk about the dead cat, not about the argument you were just losing. So the fact he's talking again about this 350 million is because it's a dead argument. It's long ago. It's simply a political device to distract attention away from the business of the day. There's a real problem, as you say, if people like the National Statistics Office engage in a serious conversation about the dead cat. There's also a kind of a psychology problem that you tend to remember 350 million and you tend to remember the fake news, even though you have, if you like, cognitively, you know those numbers are wrong, you still remember them very vividly. So there are dangers.
Yeah, but the politicians do that way also, because, for example, Spain is the country that fastest growing in the Europe. It's not the first one, it's the third one, but it's not the first, but they are repeating all the time. So maybe it's like a circle. Politicians repeat, people always are hearing the same. So we say, no, it's not true, but it's a circle. It's so complicated to do that way. So for that reason, I think the fact checker can change the political argument. It's just like a public service to the people who want to know if it's true or not, but just for make decision by her own. So.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we're going to move on to the next topic because we've still got a lot to talk about. And this one is about, and this is a sort of, all of these things are linked together, and you'll see there's a lot of cross-cutting themes that are coming up through various sessions. And this one is about statistics offices or media outlets. So we've all seen that a number of statistical institutes have launched advanced communication campaigns. Some of them have even got their own TV studios. And they've got these fantastic, beautiful packages, videos, all these good data visualizations, and also narratives as well. So the question is, are massive media-like communications efforts appropriate? Are they an effective approach for the statistical offices to take? And what are the potential risks? What are the benefits? And to talk us through and to introduce this topic for us, I'd like to give the floor to Aurel Schubert.
Okay, thanks for the question. Maybe I can again differentiate our policymakers, which we serve. First of all, don't need this kind of gimmicks, and so they are still fine with graphs and explanations to graphs for their policymaking decisions. But it's clear that the other users, and usually talk about like an onion, where you have different kind of users in-house and then going out-house, and journalists, the public in general. I mean, the ways how to grasp information today has simply changed over time, and so you have to adapt to that. So just producing tables and spaghetti graphs is maybe no longer the way to get what you want to do, namely to get the message across. So in that sense, you have to. We are part of these elites which have to go the extra mile to our users or to those which we want to address. So you have to use tools which they use and which they understand. So I know, and it's not just for statistics, but for all the functions of the central bank, which are not that easy to explain, that now there is a lot of use of video, where there are short explainers of 1, 2, 3 minutes, and they seem to be extremely popular, where things like quantitative easing or negative interest rates, all these kind of things. We use them a lot. Okay, and there are maybe also in all languages. I don't know if you're just, but so that these things are very popular. I heard we had 700,000 clicks in the last 12 months on these explainers, for instance. So these are things where you don't have to do the very, very fancy thing, but get closer to the people. It's also clear that now, and you mentioned like the case of Spain, that people more and more want to put things into comparisons. So people want comparisons. So you have to also supply those. We have to move away from static presentations to dynamic, as people want to see over time how things are developing. And unfortunately, Hans Rosling is no longer around, but you have seen him, how he presented these things to make things much more memorable. And it's clear by all studies that human beings are much better in capturing visual information than words. And so we have to use this also. So there is a strong tendency now to produce dashboards. And then one example is, for instance, in the crisis, what turned out there is this enormous interlinkages in the financial markets. And now we are trying to do, and we have launched this recently to show these interlinkages with nice graphs and arrows, which we stole from, no, we didn't steal, but we got from Bertelsmann, which they use, where you can really show which, for instance, the question, from whom are the central banks buying all these bonds? So who is selling? So this kind of question, you can put it into tables, but nobody will remember. But if you put it into one graph, where you see the different arrows going, and you can even move over time, these are very much appreciated. So I think we should embrace these kind of things, but we don't have to jump on every new fashion.
Mm. Would any of other, Jim, and then?
Yeah, again, there's a crisis of why are people spending all this money on outfits like Eurostat? And clearly we need some good answers to that. I think Enrico offered us an interesting model. He was talking about evolving information ecosystems and talking about the role of national statistics officers as brokers, integrators, modelers. And I think that's a kind of an important idea to say how is the data landscape shaping and who is going to be sitting there as the broker, who do we trust? I think NSOs are in a good position from the viewpoint of thinking about democratizing data, because again earlier today people were talking about this important theme of what do we value and can we measure it, rather than turning it on its head and it's easy to measure, therefore it must be valuable. So how do we actually elicit those constructs from citizens? So how can Eurostat serve its own needs and serve the needs of the community by being this new player in an information ecosystem, but also democratizing the process to get more questions, challenges? Okay, these things are really socially important. Can we get a handle on measuring them? So Sustainable Development Goals is a good example, but there'll be others in other domains.
Thank you.
So the way I'm going to frame this is purely from the practice of journalism, and is I would appreciate much more that they put all that effort into give us the underlying data, or providing a systematic way to get to that underlying data, and train journalists to be able to read and understand that data and apply statistical processes to get stories out of that, rather than transform themselves into newsrooms, because journalists are, except for the two of us, are mostly lazy when it comes to statistics.
Me neither, okay?
You neither, okay, sorry. So if we get a nicely packaged set of statistics, of charts, and of stories, we're not gonna do the work, and we're just gonna devour that and spit it out in a different style, in our newspaper style, and be done with it. I've witnessed that in papers where I've worked. So to go against that, if you make it easy for this growing trend of data journalism, of data journalists, even in small blogs, even in smaller publications, to get to that underlying data, and you keep and you're open to have them ask you questions and nagging you, I think it will be more valuable for the information ecosystem actually, than putting all that effort and all that money into turning yourselves into newsrooms.
Though of course it does depend, because if you're targeting the public, then they perhaps need that type of information. But if you're doing things for journalists, they need a different type of information.
Yeah, but I think most the audience, the general public, doesn't get their information from the NSOs directly.
Yeah.
So
I think in terms of bangs for buck's influence, one of the interesting things that Full Fact did at the time of the a general election was to get a large number of volunteers to support their fact-checking activities, especially with TV debates between politicians. So you'd have real-time fact-checking. One of the major providers of fact-checkers were people working at the National Office, the Office for National Statistics. And again, I think outfits like Eurostat could really benefit from that kind of investment of time, because it's time limited. There's a lot of professional development going on, because clearly people are then put in a different position of, I want you to find a piece of information quickly, put it in a form that a non-statistician would understand. The least it does is to show you how awful your own website is. I don't know so I think in terms of bangs for bucks, that punctuated effort and energy is likely to deliver far more than a long-term investment with rather diffuse aims to improve people's knowledge of the data that's easily accessible.
Roger, I want to ask you, something that you mentioned on the phone to me, and I just think it's really, really relevant about the fact that you may be doing the figures or whatever, but then if they're not published, in a way, that's what journalists have to be looking at, why they're not being published. And you've got a recent example for us on that.
Yeah, there's a number of examples. I know you'll find this shocking in the United States in the current political environment, where official statistical agencies aren't either allowed to put out information, or they put out information that's false. A very recent example is a hurricane went through Puerto Rico, and power was lost to the entire population. And for about a week, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, published statistics on the rate of returning electricity. That information is no longer being provided. So we have to have journalists go in. And it's not unique to the current administration. So during the Obama administration, when there was the Macondo well BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, daily published the flow rate of the destroyed well into the Gulf of Mexico. And at some point, that information disappeared because it was bad news. It was politically unacceptable to have that. So I could go on and on. There's plenty of examples like that. But sometimes official government agencies aren't allowed to do their official work. And that's where, again, we need, in a lot of cases, good investigative journalists to fill those gaps. Because we can't always assume that governmental agencies have the license or authority to do the right thing.
Thank you.
I just want to say that for me, it's not. I think it's a good idea to the people who are approaching to the data. Maybe it's a good idea to do this package for, I don't know, Twitter or something like that, for the data of the day or something, or the statistics of the day. I don't know. But for me, as a journalist, I say that I have that it's not possible to use this video because I want the data, I want to do the research, the investigation, and I want to show the people and the audience different perspective that the official statistics like Eurostat or central bank it's not going to happen. So it's just do your job as a journalist, I think.
I mean, just not to got misunderstood. Yes, we are obviously publishing also the data. So
yeah, I know that.
1.5 million data series in the public.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea for
so
the people who don't know anything about data. It's a good idea to democratize. Yeah.
It's a difficult word.
Yeah. But for me, as a journalist, I want to show the data. Maybe it's better if I know how to show it, and how to research, and what kind of perspective can I use for the public.
I think it's just important not to forget there are different audiences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And
yeah.
with today's technologies, you have the privilege to directly address also the ultimate users, but there you need a different lighter versions, which we also provide. Yeah.
Okay, right. It's now time for you to give your opinion because we're going to have another question on our app. And the question, which is now, the voting is now open, is in which communication channels should statistical offices invest more? The options are mass media outreach, social media outreach, development of apps, engaging with the world of education, or other. And of course, if you're watching via the web streaming, you can also vote as well. So I'll leave the voting open for a moment. Have we got any questions coming in from Twitter at the moment? No, I see everyone's obviously very tired. But I know that we had one gentleman in the audience who wanted to ask a question before, so we'll go to you now.
Good afternoon. My name is Walter Rademacher, La Sapienza University. You might laugh now. My question is a little bit linked to what Jim has said, because up to now we have mainly focused to discuss better communication at the end of the production chain. Mm-hmm. But I think if we really want to be more democratic and open debates with our data instead of closing debates, then it is important that we go upstream the production chain and think about how to allow participation of the civil society in the design of statistics as regards what is measured, this is what Jim has said, and how it is measured. My example is, and this fits quite nicely to what Aurel has said, if you take the consumer price index, inflation rate, then this is, of course, for the moment, designed for the purposes of decision-making in the ECB. Now, we have seen in 2002 that the European citizens were quite shocked because with the introduction of the euro, many haircutters and pizzerias and so forth used the opportunity and increased the price level. And even my wife told me, the way you measure inflation is absolutely wrong, because I know better. Now, in the article in The Guardian, William Davis had made it very clear that normal people have a huge difficulty to understand our high aggregated, very abstract variables. So the question is, how could we do better in letting the civil society come in the phase of design, but also production? For example, in this case, 2002, we could have allowed to calculate an alternative subjective price index, which of course we did not because we wanted to defend our proper methodology, but people didn't understand. So how could we do better? This is my question.
Thank you. Well, Jim first, and then...
The Office of National Statistics, in particular Alan Smith, produced a measure of inflation where essentially people could go online and they would say what percentage of their income they spent on transport, on food, on entertainment, on IT. And this was then publicly vilified by the Treasury because obviously there's only one rate of inflation. But this then stirred up a very interesting debate, and it got people really having interesting statistical arguments in public arenas, in mass media, about this the nature of measurement and whether there are absolutes and so on. So that's a very simple example of the processes you're talking about.
Anyone else want to answer that? No? But that's a particularly interesting one because people, they had an emotional connection with the data because they could really see, can I afford to live in this area? For example, where my parents used to live and I grew up in, but I now can't afford to live there. So, you know, it was interesting from that way as well. Okay, I'm now going to close the voting. So the voting is now closed, and I'll give the technical wizards a second to just, I won't say manipulate the figures, because of course they're not doing that. I mean, get the figures into a presentable form. There you are, that's the way to say it properly. And just give me a sign when we're ready to display. Oh, lots of discussions going on there.
No, because they had the second question displayed, so they shall now vote for the one you read.
Ah, okay. Okay. Apparently, you had a different question on your. No one mentioned that. Of course, you're all sitting there voting on the wrong question. Okay, so we're going to do the voting again, or are we? Oh, we did manage to get it right. Okay, fantastic. So here we have. And the winner is social media outreach. That's interesting. We don't really. No one's interested in developing any apps, but engaging with the world of education. We're certainly going to be talking about that elsewhere in this session when we're going to be talking about media literacy. So that's tying in well with there. But social media outreach, what do we think, panelists, about social media outreach, on investing more on that?
No, I think our communication people use this also, Emeritus, to raise awareness that there is new information available. I mean, that's okay. A different thing than getting really the information across, because I think it's 140 characters, so we're going to double that now, so that the president can say a little bit more, but it's 140 characters. So you can only raise the awareness about new things that are here, or maybe a headline, but otherwise I wouldn't see it as the perfect way to convey messages.
What do you think, Jim?
I think there's a role for gamification that we could use. What we did with the Constituency Explorer, which was there was 100 and some variables on each of 500 constituencies. So there's a colossal amount of data there, which you could get up from your smartphone. But if you went into your smartphone, you could be, the first thing you would see would be a quiz with 7 items. You'd key in your town name or your postcode, and you then get a quiz relevant to the local demographics. What proportion of people in your area are Muslim? And you then get a score, and you then get the real answers and the national answers. So that aspect of gamification to suck people into thinking about, do I actually want to go into the website and actually play with some of this data myself and look at what other constituencies are like. So I think there's a lot of scope there for that kind of development.
Thank you. Interesting. Right, I'm going to move on to the next topic now, which is about visual evidence that works. We've talked a lot about visualization. The idea of capturing policymakers' attention at the right time is not always easy, and of course good data visualization can help with that. But not everybody understands those graphs, or not all of them are easily understood, and that can cause problems as well. So we're talking about effective visualization here. And that's really important because it also helps us cut through the information overload, and we can see something very clearly, one visual that helps us out. So the issues here is what is effective visualization? How does this differ by target group? Because not everybody has the same understanding, or you don't want to get necessarily the same messages across the same groups. And are there any examples that we can maybe think of that could work? And of course, since we have an expert in data visualization and visual journalism, I'm going to ask Xaquín to start us off on this topic.
I'm going to address one of the situations that happen quite a lot in news media, traditional or not, and is to use visualizations as making something look pretty or look nice, and maybe that way I can actually answer what I think of effective visualization, because making something look nice is one of my pet peeves. It just drives me crazy, because I think it's an insult, and it's degrading to what the actual power of visualization. And it's in our priorities as as graphics editors or visual journalists. Making something look nice is right here at the bottom of our priorities, because it leads to two different temptations. The first one is to commission graphic designers to sexy up and jazz it up your information. And the other one is to use novel ways of visualizing something purely for the aesthetics of them, instead of, because they are the visualization that can, from which you can actually gain insight and learn something about the patterns and the underlying trends in that visualization. And that one is a very difficult one to deal with, because we're all attracted, or most of us are attracted to a nice looking visualization. So you actually have to ask yourself, is this answering what it really should be answering? So the first thing we start with when we produce this visualizations is, what's the question I'm going to ask the data, and is this visualization the answer to this, or does it provide an interface for whoever is going to look at it to gain insight from it? And that's in the visualization part. I think the most interesting thing is something you were mentioning before, Aminda, is the emotional connection between what you're trying to tell the audience and the data, and it's the other way of responding to how to connect to the reader is, how do you frame the data itself? In which terms do you frame the data? And there's a very nice example from The Guardian. It's a project that I hold very dear. It's called An Affordable Country, in which we took the entire Her Majesty's land registry, all the sales of private properties or houses, I think, in England and Wales, the 20-something million records from 1995 to 2015. And of course, we wanted to map them and see how the price of housing had changed in England and Wales. But then in one of those meetings, someone said, what if we put it in terms of your salary? So of course, when we tried that, when we did the first draft of that interactive, it was so revealing, not just the change from 1995 to now, but just in the micro story term, when you put on your salary and you all of a sudden see that, whoa, you cannot afford it where you live now. You wouldn't be able to afford it where your parents live in, like outside London, and likely you're not going to afford it because the trend is like this. And the response it got from whoever was reading it was a very emotional one, and we saw that when people were talking about it in social media. Was like, holy, I just can't. Or, whoa, maybe if I were smart 10 years ago, I could have bought my house. Now I am completely screwed. And so that was a very, very good example of how to connect with the audience, how to establish an emotional connection by framing the data. But the New York Times uses and it reminded me of what Jim was saying before, is the little quizzes to put people in the frame of mind of understanding the data before they start reading the story. And it's a model that the New York Times uses. They call it "You Draw It." Although I think they take it a little bit too far. The first one they did was they ask you to chart the relationship between the family income and the chances of children to get to college. It was assuming that the New York Times readers knew how to draw a trend line, which I'm pretty sure most of the Times editors did not really understand what they were being asked. But it was a really good example because it put you, it made you get into frame of mind before you were reading the rest of the story that was very revealing. And we've done it at the Guardian, not in the same fashion, but in quizzes like the one you were talking about. Before you start explaining someone that immigration is not really a problem where they live, ask them, what do you think the level of immigration is in their region or in their, not at constituency level. And you'll see that your perception of reality is so far off from what it really is, that it may change the way you look at things.
Thank you. Roger, I know you've got an interesting example when talking about visualization or explaining data to people, and it's another flooding story.
So it's a long time ago, about 20 years ago, I was on a disaster survey team in North Dakota. And one of the questions that I was the social scientist on the team, and one of the questions we had is that why was it that the National Weather Service was able to forecast a record flood 2 months in advance, and yet people had to evacuate in the middle of the night, completely surprised by the fact there was a record flood. And the story there is that they had forecast there would be a 49-foot flood, the biggest flood ever. And what people heard when they heard that message was everything will be fine. Why did they hear that? Because the biggest flood they had previously was 48.8 feet. So they said, well, it's this much more. How bad can it be? The Weather Service was trying to send the message with a number. This is going to be the worst thing ever. And the message that was received, everybody understood the number. The message that was received was, don't worry, go to bed. There won't be a flood. So it's a great lesson in the sending of a message, you know, whether visually or numerically or with words. It's not always the message that different people receive. So we have to be careful as experts in trying to send messages with data. No matter how well we present it or make it pretty, there's always going to be a diversity of interpretations of what that data signifies in a particular context.
And of course, the personal way that you look at the data and you compare yourself to it. I was thinking about the other example we talked about binge drinking figures.
Yeah, there's so on university campuses in the United States, there's a lot of worry about young people who binge drink, who drink to excess on weekends, sometimes on Tuesday nights, sometimes on Wednesdays. And so one of the strategies that university officials thought they would employ was to let students know what the median drinking amount was of the students, because the idea was many students will realize that there's a lot of students who drink less than they do, and they won't drink as much. What they didn't think of is there's going to be an equal number of students who say, oh my gosh, I have to catch up with my peers. So sending messages with data is fraught. This is when we get to the question of what works. A lot of the action isn't in the data, it's in what we think works actually means.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to the next topic, unless have we had any tweets on this one? No? Okay. All right, we've got a question over there. Okay, would you mind saving them up? Because I would like to move on, because the next topic that we're going to talk about is something we've already talked about a little bit, but I think it's really important to spend time talking about it, which is statistical literacy. Because as we know, not everybody understands numbers, but there are techniques to help the general understanding and statistical literacy. Because at the end, statistics, if people can read statistics, they can then also start to hold policymakers and politicians accountable. But how can the official statistics community reach out? We saw from the poll before that you're all quite keen on working with education institutes. And so I think it's time that if we hear from Jim Ridgway from Durham University, who is actually doing exactly this.
Okay, thank you. The challenge, I think, isn't simply that we're trying to reach an audience that don't have skills in the use of numbers. There's also a kind of a danger of fear of numbers, and almost a kind of an anti-quantitative approach. So statistical literacy isn't simply about absence of skill, it's got other sorts of components. I'm involved with a project called Pro-Civic Stat, which is basically saying statistics curricula at high school level and undergraduate level should actually be addressing major issues like migration, poverty, inequality, and that we should be using this as basically the core medium from which to teach statistics, rather than to say, here's a really important statistical technique you need to learn, so here's some artificial data, now show me you can turn the handle and do this. Okay. So we've actually produced a framework which is relevant to this group, which is about statistical literacy. I'm going to cheat and read my own words. So if anybody wants a copy of this about our conceptions of statistical literacy. So the thing at the top is actually meaning for social policy. So a statistically literate person is somebody that understands what the implications of statistics are for social policy. Another big component is disposition, which is basically a willingness to engage. And Arno gave us a lovely example of that earlier when everybody's worrying about percentages, and he says, well, okay, there's the percentages, what are the raw numbers? You know, so there's a kind of a disposition to want to engage and to ask statistically pertinent questions whenever you're presented with evidence. Okay, and I think another big part of statistical literacy has actually got to be to understand the big ideas that statistics offices wrestle with, which are to do with the nature of measurement. What do you measure? How do you measure it? How reliable is it? All those sorts of things. Core ideas about, you know, if you're making a judgment, is it an absolute judgment? Is it a relative judgment? Knowing that measures have quite different properties. If you measure poverty in absolute terms versus in relative terms, the two measures function quite differently in different circumstances. Okay, so if you've got a relative measure and an economy is completely wiped out, well, hey, great, we've just eradicated poverty. Whereas if it's $2 a day, well, actually, suddenly the whole population is poor. So you need to know that different measures function in different ways. And these are understandable ideas. They're the heartland of the things that statistics offices deal with, and they're absolutely central to understanding social phenomena. And these should really figure large in the kinds of things that we do when we teach students. Okay, so what can statistics offices do? I think so it's supporting some educational activities. I mean, first of all, if anybody here has leverage over education systems in their country, please tell them that whatever they're doing is completely wrong and they need to rethink it.
I'm sure that'll go down well, okay.
I think that is universally true. I'd be delighted to be proven wrong, but I think we need to be moving towards a conception of statistical literacy that is essentially data science literacy. I don't mean necessarily getting people to program, but understanding sources of evidence, understanding the vices and virtues of algorithmic approaches. So I'm not talking about constraining statistical literacy to be the kind of well-defined data sets. We need to be thinking about people's understanding of uses and abuses of big data. Things that statistics agencies could do is sort of supporting educational initiatives like poster competitions, things like the sorts of hackathons where you present a rich data set and you get rival teams to interpret them in very short timescales. So people have as much Coca-Cola, a lifetime supply of Coca-Cola and pizza, and 48 hours, and the clock starts, and at the end of 48 hours they have to present an analysis. So again, national statistics offices could be producing interesting and provocative data sets to stimulate these kinds of activities. Again, I think that several things we've talked about. There's a kind of a wave of interest. People like mathematical puzzles. They like Sudoku, and they like quizzes and television quizzes. So how come we can't capitalize on that? What can we do to capitalize on this kind of groundswell of interest in challenge, competition? Why is it always so boring? How have we... You'd think it was quite a fine achievement given how interested people are in problem solving, engaging, it's just great that nobody's interested in the stuff we do. I don't know how we've done it, but okay. Working with fact checkers, I think, is, again, relatively inexpensive and a really good way to go forward. I'll stop.
Okay, anyone from the panel have anything to add to all of that, media literacy?
Yeah, I think it's so complicated, this item, because you say quiz are popular on TV, but maybe it's not true. Maybe they don't have too many audience, because I speak for the Spanish television, because my TV program show on Sundays on La Sexta, is a channel, news channel. It's on prime time, so we have to fight with Big Brother on another channel. So, for example, if I'm talking about poverty, all these kind of things, I have to explain what is the poverty, how many people are in this kind of situation. To visualize that, I have to talk with people to show the data is true and all this kind of things. It's so complicated to take the people to this area. So I know that it's not important the beauty of the graphic, but on television, if we want to attract more people, I think it's important, this kind of instruments. You have to show graphics that you can see in one way. I don't know, it's different. It's a different media, so the way to explain is different too. So I don't know, I'm super, I think it's okay what we say, but it's complicated.
Just very briefly, because I think I'm going to be bad against the profession again. I have the luxury of not working for a specific media company right now, so I can do this, although I used to do it before that too, is that we think that the general public is not knowledgeable in math and in statistics and in and they're not visual literate. But it's actually the newsrooms who are very, very, very illiterate when it comes to numbers, and they're very resistant. Their editors have witnessed editors like almost literally do la, 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 when you go ahead and start like throwing numbers at them. But the public do understand this. My wife is a scientist, and I was telling her how I was trying to explain to a journalist what a median was. And she's like, honey, but that you learned that in high school. And I'm like, yes, I know you learned that in high school, but it was a long time ago, and for some people, numbers and math are not a way of, they don't think that it's a way to get to a story. And they get to publish headlines that say there's an increment of 100% in whatever the variable, instead of saying it doubled. And when you tell them, oh, you could make a better headline if you say it doubled, they're like, wait, what? No, it's not the same thing. They're like, yes, honey, it's the same thing. But the problem is, to me, is that the resistance comes from the people that is supposed to translate that data to the public. We're afraid of them. We're afraid of the numbers. We don't think we don't understand them, and we think that our audience is not going to understand it. Pew Research Center did a very adorable question in one of their surveys. They asked the public to interpret a scatter plot, and 70% of respondents answered, interpret the scatter plot correctly. If you do that in a newsroom, the number would
it wouldn't be
probably
70%.
Yeah.
just it's not just a journalist, not just a journalist. It's also the same with our decision makers, the politicians. So here's a nice story from May Financial Times, where the then shadow Home Secretary, as the Interior shadow minister from the Labour Party before the election, she was pleading that there need to be 10,000 additional police officers. And they asked her, how much will this cost? And then she was thinking, so about £300,000 a year. So, which is about £300 per officer per year. And then they, that's maybe not right. And she started counting for after minutes and so on. I said, maybe 80 million, which would mean there's about £8,000 per. So it was, but she has an education as an historian from Cambridge University. But these are the policymakers. So it's just that the more that this whole notion of numbers, and as you mentioned before, the fear of numbers is very prevalent. But I think to put it in a bigger context, we are living in a world where more and more, it's becoming more and more financial. It becomes much more that you have to take care of yourself, pension, etc. So there are many people who have completely wrong assumptions about if they save 50 euros a month in their pension, how much pension they will get at the end of the day. So these are crucial questions. So, and the more, and now with the new gimmicks with the phone, smartphones, etc., you have more and more financial inclusion. You can do all kinds of things automatically, and it's even sexy to do these things, contactless payment, etc. But the people, if they don't understand what they are doing, it becomes a big problem. So this. And it pushed to more financial inclusion, having more and more engaged people in these things, but without giving them the financial literacy or numerical literacy is enormously dangerous, and also for policy-making institutions, because you're not understood.
Yeah.
And the less you're understood, the less effective your policy is, because people might behave completely irrationally or not the way you expect it. So I think it's a major problem which needs to be addressed very much at the root. And we can contribute a little bit to it, but it needs to be addressed very, very early on, because that can lead to big problems in the future.
Thank you.
I was hoping you were going to read the quote. There is nothing cute about innumeracy.
Yes, there is nothing cute about innumeracy, because actually people are usually proud that, numbers, that's not for me, but and they say here, but if you cannot spell, or you cannot talk, is that a problem? Yeah, that's a problem, but numbers, no, that's not for me, that's for others.
And in fact, not just literacy. I think I can also attest that journalists have a great need for some help, and so perhaps that's something else that statistical offices could be working with the journalists, as we've heard a couple of times. I'm not going to take any questions on this, because I'm going to take them all at the end, because we're really running out of time, and we've got one more topic to do on this session, which is most important because it's about uncertainty. It's about how we communicate uncertainty. We've talked about working with scenarios, but how do we present uncertainty? Do people understand what uncertainty is? How can we visualize it? And to introduce this, I'd like to get Roger to start us off.
Yeah, I'll start us off real quick. I think the statistical community and experts generally do a really good job when it comes to issues of balls and urns and samples from populations and measurement uncertainty, and that's usually well communicated, if not always well understood. But I want to raise a class of issues that I think data journalists in particular do a very poor job with, and those are the situations where the statistics themselves can influence outcomes that we care about. And I'll give you an example, was the US election of 2016. So in that case, we had a number of different, very prominent data journalists, Nate Silver, the New York Times, Vox, producing daily updates on the probability that Hillary Clinton would win, which was very high. I think the low number the week before the election was 85% chance, the high was 99% chance. And it became very much a horse race. In the sense that it was who can have the better prediction. It wasn't anything about policy or even politics. It was about public opinion polls. The public opinion was well measured. It was well communicated. Everyone everyone understood that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And what happened is that the statistics became an intervening variable in the outcome. And one question that social scientists will hopefully soon be addressing is to what degree did turnout become suppressed because everyone expected that the outcome was going to be a Hillary Clinton victory. So in what sense was the prediction self-falsifying? And this is particularly true for statistics that are related to statements of expectation. Economists are used to this. So if a central bank says that interest rates are going to go up or down, it's going to move markets, and it could become self-fulfilling. But data journalists, particularly as they involve themselves in politics and policy, I think in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases view themselves as standing out in space, looking down on the earth, and not inside the system and part of the system where they have influence. That's not really uncertainty. That would be fundamental ignorance, is that we don't really fully understand the role that introducing statistical ideas and concepts into democratic systems has on those systems. So I think we need to up our game as experts when we do try to communicate, because it's not you speaking truth to power sort of thing. It's a much more complicated situation, and it's much more than balls and urns.
I know you have.
I just like jumped at it. I think you're totally right, but it's quite an accusation for data journalists. What I wonder is, I was going to answer something different, but since you went onto the accusation of lowering the turnout for Hillary, what I wonder is, whose fault is that? Because what data journalists, what the upshot of the New York Times, what Nate Silver at 538 did, was just this is what we are. We're averaging all this. We're running the simulations, and this is what the outcome might be. But they're not. Nobody was saying don't go to vote because she already won. And that's something that I wonder if it's beyond just the data journalist's fault. It's fault of the entire system. The rest of the news media didn't say, hey, but remember, you still have to go to the ballot box. And it's the politicians saying, like, but remember, you still have to go vote.
Well, and Hillary Clinton did not go to two major states that she lost, Wisconsin and Michigan, because she believed the polls. But here's where it gets kind of surreal, is that when data journalists issue these predictions, they have to put a disclaimer. This is our prediction of what would happen if you didn't know we were making this prediction in the first place and didn't change your behavior in any way. And so this gets to really complicated questions about what's the role of experts in society, and what are we supposed to communicate?
I mean, I do understand that it actually shapes your. Okay, this is fine. We're not gonna in New York or in Wisconsin. This is fine. We won't have to vote, but people still do go to votes. Have we done the exercise of see how the turnout changed in those states? Did Democrats don't go to the polls because they were being told, oh, it's fine, she'll win? I don't know if
I think we're getting into a very sort of a topic, a conversation over a drink. I think this needs to go further.
We'll go over.
Okay, well, we are coming to the end. I'm sorry to sort of cut you off, Roger, but I think we've already had some discussions about uncertainty today. So now I'm going to take those two questions that we had from earlier, which I haven't forgotten about. Please keep them super, super short, and we'll keep the answers short as well.
Hi, my name is Ioannis Antipas. I'm a Greek data journalist from Protothema in Athens, Greece, and I would like to ask you, mostly Xaquín, you work with both sides of the Atlantic in terms of data journalism. Where do you think are the main differences of the cultures towards working with data for a journalistic perspective? in those two sides in terms of how easy it is to work with editors or with newsrooms, and B, how easy it is and how accessible data is for the purposes of data journalism. Thank you.
Okay, before you answer that, we're going to get, I'd like the other question as well.
I'm Sibylle von Oppen from the Statistics Germany, and my question is, we know that we have more non-users than users of official statistics, and how we reach them. Therefore, I was not surprised that we voted for reach out with social statistics and invest in that, and also invest in the visualization, because that goes together. You cannot reach out in social media if you do not invest in very clever and smart visualization. That is what we found out. And what do you do when nobody comes to you? You have to go there where the people are. And what we found out is we have a new software now, and we look into rooms where people, interest group, discuss things where they really need official statistics to have a good basis, like lawyers on price indexes for housing prices, for example. And then we find, we find that there is nobody talking about official statistics, and then we send a link to them. This is what we do.
Thank you. Would you like to answer that quick question about the difference Europe and US?
It's a very quick answer. Sadly for us, US wins for now, both in the newsrooms and in the official release of statistics. The fact that they, from very granular level, and from the federal government to local governments, they're very serious about disaggregating their statistics. Not so much in Europe, especially in Spain. The only issue I have with the UK, which is very transparent, very much better than in Spain, is that you guys have way too many levels of admin levels, and none of them match with each other's, which becomes a nightmare for you guys, right? So for now, the U.S. wins, but I think there's a trend. There's a trend in newsrooms in Europe, because we had it so much more difficult than the U.S. Of finding novel ways of getting to those statistics. So.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone want to make a comment on that? Well, I think yours was less a question, more an observation. So, right, I think we're going to have to leave it there. What I would like to do, though, I know you were all desperate to go off, but what I'm going to do is, while I'm giving you the housekeeping for what's happening next, I've got a question for you. Last question on the app, okay? They thought they'd finished. Okay, the last question on the app, which I'm now going to open the voting, hopefully, they're not going to go mad, is what do you consider the most compelling argument for official statistics? Okay, so you need to refresh your thing, and the answers are impartiality, authoritative figures that settle discussions, guaranteed supply according to schedule, quality, and something else. Please vote quickly, because I'm not going to keep the voting open long. And those of you watching online, you've got literally a minute to do it while I'm giving the housekeeping. We're now coming to the end of the day. For those of you who are here in the hall in Brussels, we've got a social dinner after this conference, around 6:30 onwards, at the 4 Points by Sheraton Hotel, which is within walking distance from here. You should have a map in your participants pack, and also there's a map on the conference app as well. Tomorrow we're going to start at 9:30, so please be in your seats in good time for the introduction and the keynote speech. And that'll be followed by the first panel debate, which is dealing about ethical dilemmas, quite an interesting one that we've been touching on occasionally today. And for those of you watching online, we hope that you'll join us again tomorrow, and the live streaming will be starting in good time, and you're all ready for 9:30 when we start. So can we now have a look at the voting is now closed, and I'd like to see, Quality. Quality wins always. 51% of people think that quality is the most important thing. There's no something else. What else? Impartiality. Yeah? Impartiality. Really, really important. So this is something that you can perhaps talk about over your drink tonight. Before you go off, please thank our speakers for the excellent panel and for giving us all their thoughts. We'll see you tomorrow at 9:30 here for those of you who aren't coming to the social dinner. Thank you.